The twin suns of Varanth hung high in the sky, their searing heat baking the rocky terrain below into an unrelenting furnace. The planet had become the latest front in the brutal war between humanity and the Zarnak Dominion. Once a remote and unremarkable world, it was now a battlefield littered with the debris of war-charred vehicles, shattered weapons, and the lifeless forms of soldiers from both sides. Lieutenant David Carter trudged cautiously through the desolation, his pulse rifle gripped tightly in his hands. His helmet visor scanned the landscape, overlaying tactical data and thermal readouts onto his view. The ambush had scattered his unit, and now he was alone, cut off from any reinforcements. His breathing was steady, a testament to the years of discipline forged in the fires of military training. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that sent dust and ash swirling around his boots. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his armor and the oppressive heat sapping his energy. Carter had been in countless battles, but this one felt different. There was an emptiness here, a sense of finality that gnawed at the edges of his mind. As he rounded a jagged outcrop of rock, his visor picked up a faint heat signature among the wreckage ahead. He dropped to a crouch, his rifle raised, and advanced carefully. The shape became clearer as he approached a body, larger than any human, sprawled amidst the carnage. It was a Zarnak warrior, unmistakable even in death. Their kind were towering, reptilian humanoids, their bodies a combination of sinewy muscle and natural armor. This one was different, though. The curves of her armor and the intricate patterns etched into its crimson plating marked her as one of the Amazons, the elite female warriors of the Zarnak Dominion. Among the humans, the Amazons were both feared and respected, their prowess in battle the stuff of grim legends. Carter paused, his finger hovering over the trigger. The Amazon's chest rose and fell weakly, indicating she was still alive, though barely. Blood, dark and viscous, seeped from a deep gash in her side, staining the scorched ground beneath her. Her weapon lay nearby, a wickedly curved blade, its edge still gleaming with menace. Her eyes opened as Carter approached, their golden hue locking onto his. Even in her weakened state, there was a fierce intensity in her gaze. She shifted slightly, her clawed hand reaching instinctively for the blade. Carter's rifle trained on her immediately, a silent warning that any move against him would be her last. For a long moment, they were frozen in a tense standoff, predator and prey trying to determine who was which. The Amazon's lips curled into a snarl, revealing sharp, predatory teeth. "Get it over with, human," she growled, her voice guttural and dripping with disdain. Carter hesitated. Every instinct told him to pull the trigger. She was the enemy, a deadly foe who wouldn't hesitate to kill him if their positions were reversed. And yet, as he stared into her eyes, he saw something beyond the fury and defiance. Pain. Exhaustion. A flicker of something almost human. He lowered his rifle. "Not today," he said quietly. The Amazon's expression shifted from anger to confusion, her sharp features softening in disbelief. Carter moved cautiously, reaching into his pack and pulling out a medkit. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him, suspicion replacing surprise. "You risk your life or nothing," she spat, her voice weaker now. Carter knelt beside her, ignoring her protests. "We'll see about that," he muttered. As he began to treat her wound, the Amazon's gaze never left him. In the heat of Varanth's twin suns, a small act of mercy unfolded, a moment that neither soldier could have predicted, and one that would change everything. Sayara's world spun as she lay on the scorched ground, her body racked with pain. The humiliation of being at the mercy of a human was a deeper wound than the gash in her side. She had fought her entire life to prove herself among the Zarnak elite, rising through the brutal hierarchy of the Amazons to become one of their most feared warriors. Yet here she was, injured, weak, and utterly vulnerable before a creature her people regarded as inferior. The human worked with focused efficiency, his hands surprisingly steady for someone who had faced her in battle moments ago. He was unlike the soldiers she had encountered before. There was no taunting, no cruelty in his actions. His movements lacked the aggression she had come to expect from her enemies. He was silent, his expression calm but unreadable as he applied a coagulant spray to her wound. She grimaced at the sting, her muscles tensing as the chemical foam began to seal the gash. "What are you doing, human?" she demanded, her voice sharp despite her weakened state. "Keeping you alive," he replied without looking up. The words struck her as absurd. Keeping her alive? A Zarnak warrior would never waste time or resources on an enemy, let alone one as dangerous as her. Mercy was a foreign concept to her people, weakness was a sin, and sparing an enemy was an invitation to betrayal. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation. Why, she hissed, her golden eyes narrowing. "Do you hope to extract information from me, or parade me as your captive before your kind?" He finally glanced at her, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Nothing like that. Just don't see the point in letting someone bleed out if I can help it." The simplicity of his answer was infuriating. No grand strategy, no ulterior motive, just kindness? She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The humans were supposed to be ruthless, relentless in their pursuit of victory. Yet this one acted as though her life held value beyond the war they were fighting. As he worked, she studied him more closely. He was smaller than her, like all humans were, but there was a quiet strength in the way he moved. His armor was scuffed and dented, evidence of a soldier who had seen countless battles. Yet his face, though lined with fatigue, lacked the hardened cruelty she associated with warriors. "You're a fool," she muttered, her voice softer now. "This mercy will cost you your life one day." "Maybe," he said with a shrug, finishing his work. "But not today." He leaned back, securing his medkit before rising to his feet. Ciara tested her strength, pushing herself up into a sitting position. The wound was no longer bleeding, though the ache remained. She felt a grudging sense of gratitude, but quickly buried it beneath a layer of pride. Carter, she had overheard his name when he'd spoken into his comm, earlier extended a hand to help her up. She stared at it, the gesture foreign to her, before finally grasping it with her clawed hand. His grip was firm but not hostile, a strange sensation for someone accustomed to violence in every interaction with the enemy. As she stood, she swayed slightly, her legs still unsteady. Carter steadied her without a word, his rifle slung over his shoulder but within easy reach. He didn't trust her, and she didn't blame him. If their positions were reversed, she would have already struck him down. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken questions and tension. Ciara found herself at a loss for words. She was a Zarnak Amazon, bred and trained to be the ultimate warrior, yet she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. This human, this Carter, had shattered her understanding of what an enemy could be. "You're different from the others," she finally said, her voice barely audible over the howling desert wind. "Maybe," he replied, his tone unreadable. "Or maybe you've just never bothered to look." The words stung more than she expected. She clenched her fists, her pride warring with a growing sense of curiosity. Who was this human, and why had he spared her? She vowed to find out, even if it meant tolerating his presence for a little while longer. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a wasteland of jagged rocks and shimmering heat. Carter walked a few steps ahead, his rifle held at the ready, while Ciara followed in silence, her keen eyes scanning the horizon. The twin suns beat down on them relentlessly, turning the metallic sand beneath their feet into a treacherous expanse that sapped strength with every step. Ciara's pride burned as hot as the desert air. She had sworn to herself that she would never rely on a human, yet here she was, dependent on one for survival. The wound in her side still throbbed despite the human's rudimentary treatment, and every movement sent a sharp pain through her body. She hated it, hated the weakness, hated the vulnerability, and most of all, hated the unsettling feeling of gratitude she couldn't quite suppress. Carter had barely spoken since they set off. He moved with purpose, his gaze sweeping the terrain like a predator hunting for threats. Ciara found his silence unnerving. Most humans she had encountered on the battlefield were loud, either barking orders or shouting war cries as they charged into battle. But Carter was different. He seemed deliberate. She broke the silence eventually, unable to stand it any longer. "You think this truce will last, human?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "It's not a truce," Carter replied without looking back. "It's survival." Big difference. Ciara snorted, though the sound was strained. "Survival. Is that what you call dragging an enemy through the desert?" "Call it what you want," he said. "I'm not dragging you. You're walking just fine." His calm tone irritated her more than she cared to admit. She quickened her pace to walk beside him, her towering frame casting a long shadow over his. She noticed how he didn't flinch or glance up at her, even though she loomed nearly a foot taller. Most humans would have at least shown some sign of intimidation, but Carter was unfazed. "What's your endgame?" Carter, she demanded, using the name she'd overheard from his comm device. "Why keep me alive? What do you gain from this?" He shrugged. "Maybe I just don't like watching people die. Even Zarnak." Her jaw tightened. "Spare me your morality. Your kind has killed plenty of mine without hesitation." "And your kind's done the same," he shot back, his voice sharp now. "But that doesn't mean I have to." The conviction in his words gave her pause. She had never considered the possibility that a human could act outside the binary logic of kill or be killed. In the Zarnak Dominion, mercy was seen as a flaw, a crack in the armor of a warrior. Yet this human carried himself as though it were a strength. As the suns dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert, Carter halted near a cluster of jagged rocks. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, setting down his pack. Ciara watched him as he began preparing a small makeshift shelter, his movements efficient and practiced. She hesitated, then sat down a few feet away, resting her back against a boulder. Her body ached, but her mind churned with unanswered questions. "You're not like the others," she said after a while, her voice quieter than before. "Maybe," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Or maybe you're just a fool," she added, her tone sharper. Carter chuckled softly. "Could be that too." The sound surprised her. Laughter was rare among the Zarnak, reserved only for moments of triumph. Hearing it now in this desolate place felt oddly disarming. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. As night fell, the two of them sat in silence, the tension between them palpable. Yet beneath it, something unspoken lingered, a fragile understanding born of necessity. Ciara couldn't decide whether to admire Carter's resolve or pity his naivety. One thing was certain: this human was unlike any she had ever encountered. The desert night brought a stark contrast to the searing heat of the day. A biting chill crept into the air, cutting through even the thickest of armor. Carter had managed to get a small fire going using scraps of charred debris and dried desert vegetation. The flames flickered weakly, their light casting long shadows across the jagged rocks that served as their temporary refuge. Ciara sat opposite him, her golden eyes reflecting the firelight. She had shed the outer layers of her crimson armor to ease her movement, revealing the scaled plating of her arms and the intricate tattoos that marked her as an Amazon. To Carter, those markings were a mystery. To her, they were a tapestry of her victories, a story etched into her very skin. "Do your kind always wander the battlefield alone?" Ciara finally asked, breaking the silence. Carter glanced up from the piece of ration pack he was heating over the fire. "Got separated during the ambush. My squad's probably looking for me." "What about you? Why were you out there alone?" Ciara's jaw tightened at the question. "I do not get separated. I was leading an assault unit. We underestimated the firepower your kind would bring. My squad fought to the last. I survived." Barely, Carter said, nodding toward her bandaged side. She bristled at the remark, her pride stinging more than the wound. "Zarnak warriors do not fear death. If I had fallen in battle, I would have done so with honor." "And yet, you're still here," he pointed out, taking a bite of his food. Her claws flexed involuntarily, scraping the rock beneath her. "Because you interfered." "You're welcome," Carter said with a smirk, his calm demeanor only aggravating her further. She narrowed her eyes. Do not mistake my tolerance for gratitude, human. When this is over, I will return to my people, and you will be an enemy again." He shrugged. "Fair enough. But right now, you're not my enemy. You're just someone trying to survive, same as me." Giara fell silent, unsure how to respond. She had spent her entire life viewing humans as a scourge to be eradicated, a lesser species whose technological ingenuity was the only thing keeping them in the fight. Yet this one showed no hatred, no malice. His perspective was so alien to her that it left her unsettled. As the fire crackled, she studied him more closely. His face was weathered, his features sharp yet soft in a way that contrasted starkly with the brutal, angular faces of her kin. There was a quiet strength in his eyes, but also something she couldn't quite place, something that felt almost like compassion. "Your mercy confuses me," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "Your kind fights as viciously as my own. Why spare me? What do you gain?" Carter leaned back against a rock, setting his empty ration pack aside. Maybe it's not about gaining anything. Maybe it's about not losing something. She tilted her head, her brow ridges furrowing. What could you possibly lose by killing an enemy? "Humanity," he said simply, his voice tinged with a solemnity that surprised her. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning she couldn't fully grasp. Her people had no equivalent concept. Survival and victory were the only virtues the Zarnak understood. Yet, the way he said it, as though it were something fragile and precious, made her wonder. The wind howled softly through the rocks, carrying with it the distant sounds of the desert. Ciara shifted uncomfortably, unsure why his words unsettled her so deeply. She had faced death countless times, yet this human's view of the world challenged something fundamental within her. "You're a strange one, Carter," she said finally, her tone half amused, half accusatory. He chuckled lightly, the sound carrying a surprising warmth in the cold night. "I've been called worse." For a moment, the vast expanse of stars above them seemed closer, the weight of their war fading in the flickering light of the fire. Neither of them spoke again that night, but the silence felt less hostile. For the first time, Ciara began to wonder if the enemy she had fought for so long might not be as different as she had believed. Dawn broke over the desert, painting the barren landscape in hues of orange and gold. Ciara stirred from her uneasy rest, her body still aching from the wound that Carter had treated. The night's chill lingered in the air, a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat that would soon return with the rise of the twin suns. Carter was already awake, standing atop a nearby outcrop, his silhouette stark against the brightening sky. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his stance was relaxed but alert. Ciara watched him for a moment, studying the way he seemed to blend caution with calmness. She found it unsettling, how someone so seemingly ordinary could act with such composure in the face of danger. "You rise early for one who claims no fear of death," she called out, her voice still hoarse from the desert air. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her without breaking his watch. "It's not fear that keeps me alive, it's preparation." Ciara pushed herself to her feet, wincing as the movement sent a fresh jolt of pain through her side. She approached him, her footsteps crunching softly on the gritty ground. Always watching, always waiting. Do humans ever rest? Carter glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Only when the job's done. Her gaze shifted to the horizon, where the shadows of jagged rocks stretched like claws across the sand. "You speak as if survival is a job. For the Zarnak, it is instinct. We are born to fight, to dominate. Survival is not something we prepare for, it is something we take." He raised an eyebrow. "How's that working out for you?" Her eyes narrowed, but she couldn't summon a sharp retort. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. A proud Amazon warrior, dependent on a human for her life, she hated it, but there was no denying the truth of his words. "Where do you plan to go?" Carter, she asked, changing the subject. "East," he said, pointing toward a distant ridge. "There's a supply outpost near the canyon. Should be able to make contact with my unit there." "And what of me?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Depends on you. You want to survive, you'll come with me. or you can try your luck out here on your own. Zara's pride bristled at the suggestion, but the rational part of her knew he was right. Her injuries and the hostile environment would kill her long before she reached any Zarnak forces. Still, the thought of relying on a human grated against everything she had been taught. "I do not need your protection," she said firmly. "Good," Carter replied, turning to begin packing their supplies. "Because I'm not offering it. You're strong enough to walk, and you've got enough fight left in you to handle yourself. But if we're going to make it, we need to work together. That's not about protection, it's about trust." The word struck her like a blow. Trust. Among the Zarnak, trust was reserved for those bound by blood or shared conquest. It was earned through loyalty and proven strength. The idea of trusting an enemy was as alien to her as the concept of mercy had been. "And why should I trust you?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Carter shrugged, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "You don't have to. But it's a long walk to that outpost, and I don't plan on looking over my shoulder the whole way." Ciara's claws flexed involuntarily, her instincts urging her to lash out, to prove her dominance. But she held back, the faint echo of his words from the night before lingering in her mind. Humanity. She didn't fully understand it, but she could see that Carter valued it above all else. "Very well," she said finally, her voice low. "But know this, Carter, if you betray me, I will not hesitate to end you." "Fair enough," he replied without missing a beat. "Just try not to bleed out before we get there." Despite herself, Ziara felt the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. As they set off together into the vast expanse of the desert, she couldn't shake the feeling that this human was more than just an enemy or even an ally. He was a puzzle, one she was determined to solve before their journey was through. The journey across the desert grew more grueling with each passing hour. The twin suns blazed mercilessly overhead, their heat relentless, baking the sand into a shimmering expanse of molten gold. Yara felt every step in her bones, her wound a constant dull ache that flared whenever the terrain forced her to move more quickly. She didn't complain she wouldn't give Carter the satisfaction, but her pace slowed enough for him to notice. Without a word, he adjusted his stride to match hers, his steps deliberate and steady. He offered her water from his canteen, and though her pride bristled at the gesture, practicality won out. She accepted it, taking a few careful sips before handing it back. "You're stubborn," he said, his tone somewhere between amused and concerned. "And you talk too much," she replied, though the words lacked venom. They pressed on, the tension between them a fragile thread stretched taut by the unrelenting environment. Ziara found herself stealing glances at Carter when she thought he wasn't looking. His resilience intrigued her. He was not physically imposing, not like her kin, yet he moved with an endurance that defied his size. He carried himself as though the weight of the desert and perhaps the war itself were nothing more than a burden to be borne until the next fight. By mid-afternoon, they crested a rocky ridge, the shimmering heat waves distorting the landscape beyond. In the distance, the faint outline of the canyon walls came into view, jagged and posing against the horizon. Relief mingled with caution in Aziara's chest. They were getting closer to their destination, but the sense of unease she had carried since agreeing to this uneasy alliance refused to fade. "What's the plan when we get there?" she asked, breaking the silence. Carter paused, surveying the terrain below. "We'll find cover, assess the situation. If my squad's there, I'll call them off from shooting first and asking questions later. And if your squad isn't there?" He hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Then we figure something out, one step at a time." The answer didn't satisfy her, but it was consistent with everything she'd come to expect from him. Humans, it seemed, thrived on improvisation, a stark contrast to the rigid discipline and planning that defined Zarnak's strategy. It should have frustrated her, but instead, it unsettled her for another reason it worked. As they descended the ridge, a distant sound broke the monotony of the desert winds. It was faint, but unmistakable, the rhythmic thrum of engines. Both of them froze, their instincts kicking in. Ziara crouched low, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Carter dropped to one knee beside her, his rifle at the ready. "Could be my squad," he muttered, though his tone betrayed uncertainty. "Or mine," she countered, her claws flexing instinctively. They waited in tense silence as the sound grew louder, accompanied by a cloud of dust rising in the distance. It wasn't long before the vehicles came into view, 3 armored transports moving in formation, their metallic hulls glinting in the sunlight. Carter's eyes narrowed. Human design. Definitely not yours. Perhaps, as Ziara said, though her tone carried a hint of doubt. Her people had captured and repurposed human technology before it wouldn't be the first time. The transports slowed as they approached the base of the ridge, their engines rumbling to a halt. Soldiers began to disembark, their figures small but unmistakable against the backdrop of the desert. Carter stood cautiously, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. Ziara stayed low, her instincts screaming at her to remain hidden. "Friendly," Carter called out, his voice carrying over the wind. The soldiers turned toward him, their weapons trained on him in an instant. Tension crackled in the air like static electricity. "Identify yourself," one of them shouted, stepping forward with a rifle aimed squarely at Carter's chest. "Sergeant Carter, 103rd Infantry," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "Separated from my squad during an ambush." Ciara's claws dug into the sand as she watched the exchange, every fiber of her being on edge. These humans were supposed to be his allies, yet they treated him with suspicion. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen if they spotted her. Carter glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Stay down," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. She bristled at the command but obeyed, her golden eyes narrowing as she studied the soldiers. Their movements were sharp, disciplined, but there was a tension in their posture that suggested unease. Something wasn't right. The lead soldier approached Carter, lowering his weapon slightly. "Where's the rest of your squad, Sergeant?" "Dead," Carter said bluntly. "Ran into heavy resistance. I've got intel that needs to get back to command." The soldier hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the ridge where Ziara remained hidden. She held her breath, her muscles coiled like a spring. If they discovered her, there would be no time to explain, no room for negotiation. Carter's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "We good here? Or do I need to find another way to get this intel through?" The soldier straightened, motioning for his team to stand down. "You're clear, Sergeant. Let's get you to the outpost." As the soldiers began to regroup, Carter glanced back at Ziara, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest of moments. There was no time to speak, but the message was clear: stay hidden. Stay alive. She hated the vulnerability of her position, but for now, she would trust him. Just this once. The atmosphere inside the supply outpost was a stark contrast to the open, unforgiving desert they had just crossed. The air was thick with the hum of machinery and the scent of recycled oxygen. Metal walls lined the interior, and the low buzz of activity filled the space as soldiers and engineers moved between crates and terminals. Ziara, still hidden in the shadows, watched with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She had been here only briefly, just long enough to see the human world beyond the battlefield. Carter led the way, his strides confident as he approached a cluster of officers at a command console. His presence was met with a mixture of surprise and hesitation. The soldiers around him paused, their eyes flicking to his uniform, then to the space behind him, where Ziara remained hidden. "Sergeant Carter," one of the officers called, his voice sharp with authority. "Where the hell have you been? We thought you were dead." Carter gave a brief nod, acknowledging the concern but offering no explanation. "I got separated during the ambush. The rest of my squad didn't make it. I've got intel, important stuff. It needs to go back to command." The officer's eyes hardened as he looked Carter up and down, clearly skeptical. "And you just walk in here with a Zarnak warrior?" His gaze shifted to the shadow where Ziara waited, her presence undeniable. Carter's hand subtly shifted to the side, covering the small comm device clipped to his belt. "She's not a threat. We've worked together to get this far." The officer's expression shifted between disbelief and suspicion. "You're telling me you're traveling with one of them?" after all we've been through. I'm telling you that we're both alive, and I'm not wasting time explaining things that don't matter right now, Carter snapped. His usual calm had been replaced by a hard edge, the urgency in his voice cutting through the tension. Ziara, though hidden, felt the weight of the officer's stare on her. She remained still, breathing as quietly as possible, every muscle tensed and ready to react at the first sign of danger. She had no illusions about how quickly the humans could turn on her if they saw her as a threat. She had already survived one human ambush. She wouldn't make the same mistake again. The officer took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Carter. If what you're saying is true, then you have 5 minutes. After that, we get a formal briefing. Intel first, then we deal with this. Alliance of yours. Carter gave a terse nod, then turned on his heel, heading toward the central data terminal where a technician awaited. Ziara remained in place, barely visible behind a stack of crates, her golden eyes following every movement in the room. Her instinct screamed at her to act, to retreat into the shadows, but she forced herself to remain still, to stay silent. The technician at the terminal keyed in a series of commands, the soft tapping of his fingers against the console punctuating the silence. Carter approached, speaking in quick, clipped sentences as he relayed the information from his personal data recorder. The officer's eyes flicked between Carter and the screen as the data streamed in. Doesn't make sense, the officer muttered, leaning closer to the terminal. We've been getting conflicting reports from the front. This doesn't match up. Carter's face remained unreadable. I'm just telling you what I saw. There's no time to second guess it. Ciara's claws tightened involuntarily, her thoughts racing. She wasn't just a prisoner here, she was an outsider, an enemy. Every second spent in this outpost made her feel the weight of that truth more keenly. And yet, she had to admit there was a strange sense of relief in being within the confines of human technology, surrounded by others of her kind. It felt like an illusion, a fragile hope that might shatter if she allowed herself to believe it. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts. We're gonna need a debriefing, Carter. Protocol, the officer's voice final, as though it was already decided that whatever happened next, Ziara would not be part of it. Carter stood motionless for a moment, his jaw clenched tight. Then I'll tell you what I can. But Ziara stays. She's earned the right to hear this. The officer glared at him, clearly not pleased with the decision. She's Zarnak. She's a prisoner. I told you, Carter said, turning toward the officer. She's not my prisoner. She's my ally. And if you want this intel to get to command, you'll listen. There was a brief, tense silence. The officer's gaze flicked to Ziara one last time, then back to Carter. Finally, he relented, though his expression remained stiff. Fine. But if she even moves wrong, she's out of here. You're responsible, Sergeant. Carter's eyes met Ziara's for the first time since entering the outpost. For just a moment, the weight of the situation seemed to vanish, leaving only the quiet bond between them. She didn't trust him fully, not yet, but there was a strange understanding between them, a shared commitment to survival that had carried them this far. Understood, Carter replied, his voice steady as he nodded toward the officer. With that, they moved toward the briefing room, the tension between them rising as they prepared to face the next step in their uneasy partnership.